I stood at the top of the stairs, half hidden behind the ivory railing, watching them glide out the front door like they were royalty. Victor's suitcase wheels clicked against the marble foyer as he chatted with Margot, who adjusted her wide-brimmed sun hat and didn't glance back. My fingers gripped the banister tighter. I knew the trip itinerary by heart, every detail, from the private jet to the ocean view suite at the Monte Azure resort. I planned it. I paid for it. Yet here I stood, invisible in my own life, as my husband and his mother whisked themselves away to paradise without a word of invitation. No, not without a word. Victor had left words. Casual, cutting ones. "You're probably more comfortable staying behind anyway, right?" he'd said at breakfast that morning. "You've been so busy lately. Thought you might enjoy the quiet." The way he said, "enjoy the quiet," had landed like a slap wrapped in silk. There was no mistaking his tone. The trip I'd booked months in advance, the one he had initially claimed was too extravagant and unnecessary, was now theirs alone. As if I had no claim to it. As if I'd built a dream vacation just to watch it walk out the door on someone else's arm. I descended the stairs slowly once the door shut, the silence ringing louder than their departure. My heels tapped across the tile, echoing against the high ceilings of the house Victor had gradually stripped of my presence. My framed photos replaced with Margot's antique plates. My favorite throws swapped for cold leather accents. This house wasn't a home anymore. It was a gallery curated to please everyone but me. I paused by the hallway mirror. My reflection looked too calm, too collected for the storm unfurling in my chest. This wasn't just about a vacation. It never was. It was about the pattern I had been trying to ignore. The slow erasure of my presence, the whispered decisions behind closed doors, the quiet assumption that I would tolerate being sidelined. Again and again. But not this time. I walked into the study, the place where I had spent countless nights hunched over financial records, cross-checking statements, and piecing together the truth I hadn't wanted to face. Victor and Margot had been siphoning money from joint accounts for nearly a year, disguising withdrawals as business expenses, estate maintenance, even charitable donations. They'd used shell companies, buried transfers behind misleading paper trails, but they weren't careful enough. They hadn't realized who they were dealing with. I sat at the desk and opened my laptop, pulling up the folder I'd titled innocuously Monarch Archives. Inside were months of data, PDFs of falsified tax documents, screenshots of Victor's correspondence with overseas banks, invoices for properties bought in Margot's name. It had taken every ounce of self-restraint not to confront them earlier. But I'd known this day would come. It was why, 2 nights ago, I'd taken Victor's suitcase while he was asleep and slipped a sealed envelope inside. I'd wedged it just beneath his favorite blue shirt, the one he always wore to look polished but relaxed. The envelope bore no return address, no clues to its contents. Just his name, scrawled in my handwriting, as familiar to him as the curve of his own signature. He wouldn't open it right away. He was too arrogant for that. But eventually, he'd find it. And when he did, the mask would fall. Still, watching them leave like that, smiling, unburdened, it churned something visceral inside me. Rage. Not the screaming, wild kind, but something deeper. Clean. I'd given him everything. Time. Loyalty. Love. I'd played the dutiful wife at galas and board meetings, smiled beside him in press photos, even softened Margot's jagged edges in public while she sliced me raw in private. I had absorbed every blow quietly, hoping that eventually he would remember I was the one building alongside him. That I mattered. I should have known better. Victor never wanted a partner. He wanted an accessory. And Margot had always seen me as a threat. Not because I was weak, but because she knew I wasn't. Because I knew how to read numbers, how to track assets, how to dig through layers of business speak until the ugly truth bled through. She hadn't counted on me being patient. Or quiet. Or watching. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair. Let them sip cocktails on the beach and laugh about whatever version of me they had conjured in their heads. Let them think I was sulking at home, oblivious and defeated. Because while they strolled through Monte Azure under a borrowed sun, they had no idea the tide had already turned. I reached into the desk drawer and pulled out the master folder, hard copies of everything in Monarch archives. My heart pounded, not from nerves, but purpose. This wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. They thought they could write me out of my own story. They were wrong. And when they returned, they wouldn't be coming back to the same woman. Because Elena Hartley wasn't just the betrayed wife anymore. She was the storm they never saw coming. The moment the front door closed behind them, I allowed the smile to finally break across my face. It wasn't a joyful one. It was tight, composed, and sharp at the corners like the edge of a blade. I moved quickly, slipping off my heels and heading straight to the living room where my bag and keys waited, already packed and ready. The air in the house still smelled faintly of Margot's overpowering rose perfume, but that would fade. Everything she'd left behind would. I glanced at the clock on the mantel, 10 minutes until their car reached the private terminal. He wouldn't open the suitcase immediately. No, Victor would insist someone else handle it, probably a hotel staff member. But eventually, he'd dig through it. He'd find that letter. And when he did, it would detonate everything he thought he had control over. That envelope was heavier than it looked, sealed and unassuming, but inside was the spine of my plan. Financial spreadsheets showing offshore transfers under his name. Copies of property titles signed with forged notary stamps. A full breakdown of the shell corporations Margot had registered under her cousin's name. And on top of it all, a note, handwritten by me. Since you both enjoy surprises, here's one you didn't plan. I slid into my car, calm now, almost weightless. As the gates to our estate rolled open, I didn't look back. That house had been a tomb for the last year, a place where I'd swallowed silence and smiled through gaslighting. But it had also been my workshop, my war room. While they were plotting my erasure, I was mapping their downfall. Traffic was light as I drove into the city. The skyline of downtown glinted like polished steel under the morning sun, and for once, I didn't feel like a ghost moving through it. I felt real again. Purposeful. My office was on the 10th floor of the Hawthorne Global subsidiary building, tucked away in a corner suite with a view of the park. Technically, it had been given to me as a courtesy when Victor was made CEO. A titleless title, Margot had called it. Somewhere I could play executive while the real decisions were made elsewhere. But I'd made good use of it. I hadn't just decorated. I'd installed my own encrypted systems, hired a discreet third-party forensic accountant, and brought in my most trusted contact, Marissa Dean. Marissa was already there when I walked in, sipping coffee and reviewing a folder with red tabs. Her long braid was looped over her shoulder, and the look she gave me was crisp and expectant. "They're in the air?" she asked, setting the folder down. "Just left," I confirmed. "The envelope is in his checked bag. He'll find it when they land." She nodded, flipping the folder open and sliding it toward me. "Then we're green across the board. Everything's filed, time-stamped, and duplicated in the secondary cloud." I sat down and scanned the documents. It was surreal, even after all the months of preparation, to see it laid out so neatly. A step-by-step collapse of Victor and Margot's scheme, tracked down to the cent. They had laundered funds through multiple properties, tried to sell off assets held in both our names, and even orchestrated a fake appraisal on the family estate to justify an undermarket sale. And the worst part? They were preparing to make it look like I had known. Complicit by silence. A signature here, a forged email there. They were writing me into their lie. But I'd found it. All of it. And I hadn't wasted a single moment. Marissa pulled up our digital dashboard on the screen. "Your email to Graham Sterling is queued. You just need to hit send. He'll get it within the hour." Graham. Henry Hartley's longtime attorney. One of the few people Victor and Margot hadn't managed to sway. I'd waited to involve him until now, until everything was in place. Henry's passing had fractured the company, and I had suspected for some time that a piece of his legacy had been hidden. Something neither Margot nor Victor could find. Now, with them gone and me holding the map, it was time to reclaim it. I clicked send. Marissa leaned back, folding her arms. "You think he'll meet today?" "He will," I said. "If what I think is true, he's been waiting for someone to come forward. Someone who isn't them." We sat for a moment in the silence that followed. It wasn't a pause of uncertainty, it was the breath before the leap. Every step I'd taken until now had been quiet, cautious, deliberately behind the curtain. But the curtain was gone. The stage was mine. I stood up, walking over to the window and looking down at the street below. People rushed to meetings, coffee cups in hand, unaware that two of the most polished names in the city were about to lose everything they'd stolen. They thought they were clever, I said aloud, almost to myself. They thought I was decoration. A placeholder. Convenient. And now? Marissa asked. Now they'll realize, I said, turning from the window. I was the contingency plan they never saw coming. The call came exactly 9 hours later, just after dusk settled across the skyline, painting the city in streaks of copper and gray. I was still at the office, seated at my desk with a cup of now cold chamomile tea, when Victor's name flashed across my screen. For a moment, I let it ring. 5 times 6. He'd be pacing by now, desperate. Finally, I picked up. Elena, he said, breathless. What the hell is this? His voice cracked with disbelief and poorly concealed panic. I imagined him in the hotel room, suitcase half unpacked, my envelope torn open, and its contents spread across crisp linen sheets. My handwriting, my records, staring back at him like a mirror he didn't want to face. I take it you found the envelope, I said evenly. What is this supposed to be? Some kind of joke, he barked. These files, these accusations, you've got this all wrong. I leaned back, eyes fixed on the city lights beyond the glass. Do I? Then why are you calling me, Victor? Why aren't you enjoying your beachside dinner with Margot? There was a beat of silence on the line. Just long enough for me to hear the shifting gears behind his panic, how quickly he was trying to switch tactics, find a new angle. Elena, come on, he tried again, softening his tone. Why didn't you just talk to me? We could have figured this out together. I did talk to you, I snapped. For months. I asked about the withdrawals, the new properties, the business expenses that had no paper trail. You brushed me off. And when that didn't work, you gaslit me. Made me feel paranoid. Unstable. Convenient, wasn't it? You're overreacting, he muttered, but his voice had lost its bite. No, Victor, I said calmly, I'm reacting just the right amount. Because you weren't just lying to me, you were trying to erase me. Sell the house behind my back, funnel assets to Margot, and make it all look like I chose to stay home, play house, smile pretty while you dismantled everything we built. He didn't respond. I could hear only the muffled hum of the resort in the background, voices, maybe the clinking of glasses. It made me sick. You weren't supposed to find any of that, he finally said, voice low. You were never supposed to look that deep. There it was. The truth unvarnished. No denial, just the quiet resignation of a man who realized too late that his wife had been playing a different game entirely. I know, I replied. You thought I'd keep letting it slide. That I'd let Margot treat me like a stray you brought home, while you carved up my life one piece at a time. But I learned something while you were playing puppet master. I learned how to watch. How to wait. Elena, he said, his voice breaking now, you can't actually think you can come after us with this. It's not just business, it's family. I laughed. A bitter, hollow sound. Funny. You only remember we're family when you're cornered. But family doesn't do what you did. Family doesn't steal, doesn't scheme, doesn't disappear their wife from the life she built. I stood and walked to the bookshelf where I'd placed the last framed photo of us I hadn't taken down yet. Cabo, 3 years ago. He had his arm around me, grinning like a man who had it all. I stared at it, not with nostalgia, but detachment. Then I opened the drawer and dropped it inside. You know what the worst part is? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It's not the money. Not even the betrayal. It's that you thought I wouldn't fight back. That you looked at me every day for 10 years and still believed I wouldn't see you coming. Elena, please. Just, come here. Let's talk. In person. I can explain. No, I said flatly. You had your chance. I gave you so many. I was always willing to fix what was broken. But you weren't just breaking things, Victor. You were replacing me. And now? I'm replacing you. I hung up without waiting for a response. My hands trembled for a moment after, not from fear, but release. It was done. No more pleading. No more hoping he'd come back to the man I thought I married. That man had never existed, not really. He had been a facade, and I had loved him like he was real. But now I saw the truth. And I was done mourning him. I walked back to the desk and pulled up the real estate documents he'd tried to hide, the attempt to sell the Hartley estate under the radar. He'd faked my consent, created a false email chain, and forged my signature on a sales agreement. It was all right there, tucked behind accounts registered in Margot's maiden name. Brazen. Sloppy. But it was going to be his undoing. By morning, my legal team would begin proceedings to freeze the joint assets and issue a formal challenge to the sale. Victor wouldn't be able to move a dollar without alerting authorities. And Margot, well, she'd be in for a surprise of her own very soon. As I logged off for the night, I glanced once more at my darkened reflection in the window. For the first time in a long time, I didn't see a woman left behind. I saw the woman they never expected. Graham Sterling looked exactly the same as I remembered him, impeccably dressed, dignified without being cold, with those wise, calculating eyes that always seemed 2 steps ahead of every conversation. He greeted me at the entrance of his private law office just off Park Avenue with a firm handshake and a rare smile, one that didn't reach his eyes but carried something deeper. Understanding, maybe. Or relief. I must admit, he said as he led me down the mahogany-lined hallway, I've been expecting this meeting for a long time. I didn't respond right away. I was still processing how surreal it all felt, how I had stepped out from the shadows of my marriage and into this strange, charged space where truths long buried were about to be unearthed. He opened the door to a private conference room, its long table gleaming beneath a crystal chandelier. On the center of the table sat a single leather-bound folder with a brass clasp. I didn't sit. I hovered at the edge of the table, heart pounding. "This is about Henry, isn't it?" I finally asked. Graham gave a single nod. He left something behind. Something only to be shared under very specific circumstances. He paused, watching me carefully. "I assume those circumstances have come to pass?" "They have," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Victor and Margot have taken more than they were entitled to. Financial fraud, asset laundering, even forged documentation. I have proof. And I suspect Henry knew this day might come." Graham didn't look surprised. Instead, he leaned over the table and unfastened the clasp, revealing a thick stack of documents inside. He pulled out one envelope, sealed in wax with the Hartley crest pressed clean into the center. My breath caught. "He prepared a second will," Graham said softly. "A revised one, drafted just 6 months before his death. He didn't trust Victor or Margot. He feared the influence they held over the company and over you." I reached out, my fingers brushing the seal before I broke it. Inside was a neatly typed will, notarized, signed in Henry's firm, familiar hand. I skimmed it quickly, eyes widening as I took in the words. "Elena Hartley shall be granted controlling interest, 53%, in Hawthorne Global, named as successor and majority shareholder." I looked up at Graham, stunned. "He left it to me?" "He saw what you were capable of," he said gently. "Henry often spoke of your insight, your integrity. You reminded him of himself in his early years, fierce, unrelenting when it came to justice. But he feared Margot would suppress your influence if you didn't have the power to protect yourself." I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. It felt strange to hear that, like a whispered truth that had always lived in the margins finally coming to light. "He kept this from Victor?" I asked. "He kept it from everyone but me," Graham said. "The original will was never destroyed, only filed publicly. But this one was intended to supersede at the moment the right conditions were met. Namely, proof of Victor's and Margot's misconduct." I sat down slowly, the leather chair creaking beneath me. My hands trembled slightly as I folded the will again. "So what now?" I asked. "Can we make it official?" Graham gave a small nod. "We can, but there will be pushback. Victor will challenge it. Margot will throw every legal maneuver she has at you. But the documentation is airtight. Henry was thorough. He even left a letter, addressed to you. He reached into the folder again and handed me a second envelope, aged slightly, with my name handwritten in the corner in Henry's bold penmanship. I stared at it for a long moment before carefully breaking the seal. Elena, if you're reading this, then you've seen the truth with your own eyes. I never doubted that you would. You are the one I chose, not out of sentimentality, but because of your spine. Your sense of justice. I watched you from the background for years, and I saw the way you carried the weight of our family without recognition. You never did it for applause. You did it because it was right. They won't go quietly, but that's why I gave you the tools. I trust you to do what must be done. Not just to protect what I built, but to rebuild it the way it should have always been. Stand tall. You're not alone. Henry. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it to my chest for a moment, overwhelmed by the surge of emotion I hadn't expected. For so long, I'd felt like an outsider, like someone clinging to the edges of a family that never really welcomed me. But Henry, he'd seen me. And more than that, he'd believed in me. When I looked up again, Graham was watching me with quiet patience. Call a board meeting, I said, voice steady now. We're going to bring everything to the surface. He gave me a small nod. I'll begin the filings. But Elena, this won't be easy. I stood and looked him straight in the eye. Nothing about surviving them ever has been. I stood at the head of the gleaming conference table in Hawthorne Global's New York boardroom, the room still humming with anticipation as board members filed in. Faces I'd once smiled politely at now regarded me with careful calculation. Some were curious. A few looked uneasy. They knew something was coming. What they didn't know, what they never saw coming, was that today I wasn't just another executive wife sitting in on a meeting to look interested. Today, I held the reins. Marissa adjusted the laptop beside me, her expression cool and composed. She'd helped me prep the slides, the recordings, the hard truths we were about to unveil. I caught her eye and nodded once. We were ready. The screens around the room flickered to life as the virtual feed connected. In a box at the center, Victor and Margot appeared, sun-drenched and seated in what looked like the lounge of the Monte Azure Resort. Victor wore a white linen shirt, his sunglasses pushed onto his head, and Margot was wrapped in a silk cover-up that screamed wealth and disdain. Elena, Victor greeted me with a tight smile. Didn't expect to see you heading this meeting. I matched his smile with one of my own cool, practiced, deadly. Well, surprises seem to be the theme lately, don't they? A murmur rippled through the room. I didn't waste time. I launched straight into the presentation, my voice clear and unwavering as I narrated the opening slide. As of this morning, I hold the controlling shares in Hawthorne Global, as designated by Henry Hartley's revised will. All documentation has been reviewed and confirmed by legal counsel. Effective immediately, I am authorized to call this emergency session. Victor leaned forward in his chair. That's impossible. There's no such will. I assure you it exists, I said calmly. Not only does it exist, it's been notarized, witnessed, and held by Graham Sterling, your father's attorney. It names me as the majority shareholder. Margot scoffed, leaning toward the screen. That's absurd. Henry wouldn't leave this company in the hands of someone who never even bore the Hartley name. I let the insult hang for only a breath before continuing. Actually, he left it in the hands of the one person he trusted to protect his legacy from being dismantled by greed. And he was right too. Because what I've uncovered over the last 6 months proves he was right to keep this secret. The next slide loaded, financial records scrolling across the screen. I highlighted key figures, circled transactions, showed flowcharts of money being funneled through fake corporations and hidden accounts. I saw a few board members shift uncomfortably in their chairs. These funds were siphoned from joint accounts, with false invoices submitted under Hawthorne Global subsidiaries. Properties were purchased, funds laundered, all under the guise of company expenses. And it didn't stop there. Click. A short audio recording began to play, Victor's voice unmistakable. Just sign it. She won't even notice the estate is gone until it's too late. We'll move it through by next quarter and blame a bad investment if anyone asks. Gasps erupted around the table. Margot's face on the screen went pale. You recorded me? Victor shouted, incredulous. Of course I did, I replied. After months of being dismissed and deceived, I started documenting everything. You taught me that. You and Margot both. Another clip played, this time Margot's voice, low and smug. The board's too spineless to act. Elena's a pretty face in a nice dress. She won't do anything with the company. That's why she's perfect. Harmless. I let the silence stretch after that. No one spoke. The weight of her words hung in the air like smoke. This isn't just about money, I said, turning to the board members directly. It's about integrity. About who we are as a company. Henry believed in ethical business. In social responsibility. He built this company to serve communities, not exploit them. But that legacy has been corrupted. Until now. Victor was seething in his seat. You think you can just waltz in, wave a will, and take everything? You're not the CEO. Not anymore, I said. But I'm calling for a vote. Effective immediately, I motioned for the removal of Victor Hartley as Chief Executive Officer due to gross misconduct, financial fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Several members looked at one another. A few nodded. I could see them aligning, calculating. I didn't need all of them. Just enough. I also present this as an ultimatum, I continued. For those of you who participated, knowingly or otherwise, you have two choices: resign and cooperate with internal investigations, or face legal proceedings. The evidence is thorough. The authorities are already aware. This is your only opportunity to act with dignity. A long pause followed. Then the oldest board member, Mr. Aldridge, cleared his throat. I second the motion, he said. Third, another voice chimed in. The votes came one after another like dominoes. When it was over, Victor stared at the screen, slack-jawed. For the first time since I met him, he was speechless. I hope you enjoyed Monty Azure, I said, standing tall. It's going to be the last vacation you take for a very long time. And with that, I ended the call. The boardroom remained hushed for a moment, stunned. Then slowly, conversation resumed, subdued and cautious. I walked out with Marissa at my side, my heels clicking steadily against the marble floor. For the first time in years, the power in this building wasn't wielded behind closed doors by men who thought I was ornamental. It was mine, and I wasn't giving it back. The boardroom was silent, as if the air itself had taken a collective breath and was waiting to exhale. I stood at the head of the table once again, but this time there was no screen showing Victor and Margot basking in the Monty Azure sun. The remote feed had been cut. Victor was no longer CEO. The board had made it official. But there was one final piece to be played, Henry's letter. I opened the slim folder Graham had handed me that morning, pulled out the envelope marked with Henry's name in black ink, and smoothed it against the polished table. The sight of it stirred something deep in my chest. Grief, maybe. Or vindication. I broke the seal and carefully unfolded the letter. Elena, I began, reading aloud, my voice steady. If this letter is being read aloud in front of the board, then the company is in crisis. And you, my dear girl, are the only one left who can put it back together. Heads lifted, eyes narrowed, as the weight of Henry's words began to settle in. I knew Victor would not be the steward this company needed. I saw the signs, long before anyone else. But I also saw you, your strength, your intelligence, and your loyalty. I watched you work behind the scenes, your efforts quiet but powerful. You never asked for credit. But now, credit is due. I paused, watching their expressions shift, some confused, others guilty, and a few truly surprised. These were men and women who had smiled in my direction for years, nodding politely, assuming I was nothing more than the polished wife of the CEO. Now, they were learning otherwise. Henry's voice, even in ink, carried weight. To those sitting at this table, if you're hearing my words, then you've either turned a blind eye or, worse, participated in what I hoped could be avoided. You know who you are. And I trust Elena to handle you accordingly. A few members looked down at their hands. One, Mr. Lewis, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I noted it. He'd always been quick to agree with Victor, quick to brush off concerns. I folded the letter and set it down gently. You've heard Henry's words. Now let me be perfectly clear about what happens next. Marissa stood and began distributing files down the length of the table. Each packet was tailored to the recipient, documents, timelines, and signatures. Proof. No denials would stand after this. Over the past year, several of you signed off on policy changes and budget reallocations without full transparency. Some of you received personal benefits, private contracts, inflated bonuses, property deals. Whether you did so knowingly or were misled by Victor and Margot doesn't matter now. What matters is what you choose to do next. One woman, Anika Chin, who'd remained quiet through the meeting, opened her folder and paled as she flipped through the pages. "I didn't know it had gone this far," she said quietly. "You didn't ask," I said gently but firmly. And Victor counted on that. A rustle of discomfort swept through the room. Some began flipping through their folders faster, scanning for their names, trying to gauge just how deep in they were. Others sat frozen. "You have a choice," I said. "Resign, cooperate with the internal audit, and help us restore the integrity of this company. Or you can face legal action." And let me be absolutely clear, I'm not bluffing. I paused for a beat, letting the silence speak. I already have a team working with law enforcement. I've also notified external auditors. This isn't a negotiation. This is a reckoning. Mr. Lewis's voice was sharp, defensive. "You're destroying this company from the inside." I met his eyes without blinking. "No, I'm saving it from the people who already did." He looked away. One by one, board members responded. Some stood and handed in their resignations on the spot. Others asked for private meetings, desperate to explain their side. A few remained silent, calculating their options. But the balance had shifted. The tide had turned. There was no going back. By the end of the hour, nearly a third of the board had either resigned or agreed to cooperate with the audit. I would ensure their testimonies were recorded, their involvement made clear. No more closed-door decisions. No more veiled threats. As the room cleared, I felt the tension drain from my body. Not completely. There was still so much left to do, but this was the moment I'd waited for. The moment I'd earned. Not by manipulation or inheritance, but by diligence, patience, and the kind of clarity that came only from surviving betrayal. Marissa remained beside me, her arms crossed, a flicker of pride on her face. "They didn't expect you to be the one holding the sword." "They never looked closely enough," I said, gathering the papers. We stepped out into the hallway, where the buzz of activity had picked up. People were already talking. Whispers of what had happened in that boardroom would spread like wildfire. The Hartley name was being rewritten, and this time, it wasn't at the hands of men hiding behind legacy. It was me. And I was just getting started. The headlines hit before breakfast. CEO ousted in sudden power shift at Hawthorne Global, one read. Victor Hartley under investigation for financial misconduct, another. I sat at the kitchen counter in my apartment, my real home now, not the marble mausoleum Victor and Margot once called elegant, and scrolled through the flood of notifications. My phone buzzed with messages, missed calls, and inquiries from reporters. I ignored them all. Instead, I watched the morning news, where a crisp-suited anchor recapped the events like it was some corporate thriller. In a way, it was. Only I wasn't a side character anymore. I was the one flipping the script. A knock sounded on the door. Marissa. She stepped in holding a folder and a look that said she hadn't slept much either. "They've detained him," she said without preamble. Monte Azure authorities intercepted Victor as he was trying to move funds to a private account in Zurich. They seized his devices, and he's being held for questioning. I blinked once, absorbing the weight of that. So he really tried to run. She nodded, sitting across from me. Right after the board meeting. He must have realized the window was closing. Margot's been arrested here, too. Fraud, obstruction, misappropriation of charity funds. The works. That one hit harder, even though I'd been bracing for it. Charity funds? I asked quietly. Marissa flipped open the folder and laid out the audit trail, one I hadn't yet seen. The children's hospital wing your father-in-law funded. They diverted over $2 million from it. Redirected through false contractors and inflated service charges. I stared at the document, the numbers blurring as my chest constricted. That wing had been Henry's pride. He'd visited the children, donated time, not just money. To think they'd stolen from it, to fuel vacations, property deals, private yachts, it made my skin crawl. I knew they were selfish, I said, voice low, but this is evil. And it gets worse, Marissa continued. We completed the audit on Hawthorne housing properties. Victor authorized rent hikes last year on the low-income employee housing Henry protected, quietly pushed through just before the holiday quarter, buried in legal jargon no one noticed. Families who'd lived there for years suddenly couldn't afford to stay. I closed my eyes. He used the company to crush the people who depended on it most. All while blaming market inflation, she said bitterly. We've already begun contacting displaced tenants. Some are ready to testify. I stood and moved to the window, gripping the edge of the frame as I looked out over the city. The buildings no longer felt like walls closing in, but something else now, witnesses to the reckoning. Every brick, every window, part of the world I was reshaping. They made me believe I was the fool, I whispered. That I was the sentimental one. The naive one. But they were the ones who couldn't see what was coming. Marissa walked over, her voice gentler. You were patient. That's not weakness, Elena. That's strategy. You saw the cracks and waited until you could collapse the whole rotten structure. I turned to her. And now we rebuild. She nodded. One step at a time. We spent the rest of the day drafting statements, coordinating with the legal team, and preparing for the public fallout. My name was already trending on social media, some calling me a hero, others still speculating I was part of the scheme. I didn't care about the noise. I cared about the facts. By afternoon, we were at company headquarters. The once glossy corridors now felt like they belonged to someone else, me. Employees passed me with mixed expressions, curiosity, admiration, even cautious hope. Word had spread quickly. The Hartleys were no longer untouchable. In the executive wing, we found files Margot had attempted to shred. Financial statements, handwritten notes, even old check ledgers. It would all go into evidence. The team moved efficiently, scanning, logging, organizing the chaos into a narrative that couldn't be dismissed. Later, I met with HR to begin restoring the employee protections that had been stripped under Victor's leadership. I read through the emails, heartbreaking stories of single mothers priced out of their homes, longtime janitorial staff let go without cause, patients turned away from underfunded pediatric care. One message from a woman named Carla stood out. She'd worked as an administrative assistant at Hawthorne for 18 years, living in the company-owned housing with her disabled son. After the rent increase, she was evicted. They lived in her car for weeks before finding shelter. She ended her message with, I just want to believe someone up there still cares. I closed the laptop slowly, my resolve hardening like steel. I do, Carla, I whispered. And I'm going to prove it. As the sun set, I stepped into Henry's old office, now mine. His photo still sat on the desk. I picked it up, brushing a thumb over the frame. They thought they could undo your legacy, I said softly. But they didn't count on me. Outside, the city lights blinked on one by one, as if saluting the beginning of something new. The reckoning was done. Now came the restoration. I stood in the heart of the Hawthorne Global Housing Complex, surrounded by rows of modest brick buildings that had once been a symbol of security for the company's employees. The late afternoon sun glinted off the windows, some of them still cracked, some boarded, remnants of what had been allowed to crumble under Victor's reign. Now, it was my responsibility to repair the damage, not just to the buildings, but to the lives lived inside them. As I walked the path between the units, I passed familiar faces, maintenance staff, single parents, retirees, people I had only seen on spreadsheets until now. They watched me warily at first, unsure of what to make of my presence. After everything they'd endured, the surprise rent hikes, the unexplained evictions, the silence from leadership, they had no reason to trust anyone in a tailored suit bearing the Hartley name. Mrs. Hartley, a voice called softly behind me. I turned to see a woman in her 60s, her hands weathered and gripping a small grocery bag. Her eyes were tired, but curious. You came, she said. I nodded. And I'm not just here to be seen. She smiled faintly. They used to say the only time corporate showed up was when someone died or a camera was rolling. That ends today, I said. Starting now, we're not just restoring the housing program, we're expanding it. Rent caps are being reinstated. Those who were displaced will be contacted directly and offered first rights to return. And a new tenant advocacy team will be based right here. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She didn't say anything more, but she didn't need to. Her silence said it all. By the time I returned to headquarters, the legal teams were deep in damage control. Statements were being issued. Settlements reviewed. It wasn't enough to simply cut ties with Victor and Margot. We had to reestablish trust from the ground up. That meant transparency, reform, and most importantly, people. Pull up the budget breakdown for the pediatric wing, I told Marissa as I walked into our shared workspace. I want a full review of what was promised, what was stolen, and what we need to fully fund it again. She was already on it. You're not going to like the numbers. But we've found the shortfall and begun contacting former donors. Good. Triple or match. I want every child who was turned away to be contacted. Privately. Personally. They deserve better than a form letter. Marissa looked up at me, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she said, I've been waiting to work for someone like you. I paused. You've worked here for years. She shook her head. I work near people like Victor. But I've never worked for someone like you. There's a difference. Those words stayed with me as we sat down to finalize the ethics overhaul. We stripped out outdated policies, rewrote internal accountability measures, and laid the groundwork for a division that would ensure this never happened again. No more unchecked power. No more quiet corruption. Every decision from here on would have eyes on it. And I knew exactly who should lead the charge. I want you to head the compliance division, I told Marissa that evening. Her brows rose. Me? You've been the backbone of this plan from day one. You know the company, you know the systems, and you know what integrity looks like. She hesitated. Elena, that's a huge role. I'm not giving it to you as a favor. I'm giving it to you because you've earned it. And because you're the only person I trust to watch what others don't. Marissa nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling between us. Then I accept. On one condition. I raised an eyebrow. Which is? That you don't try to do all of this alone. A smile tugged at my lips. Deal. The next morning, we made it official. A press release went out, announcing the creation of the Hartley Integrity and Compliance Division, to be led by Marissa Dean. The statement detailed our initiatives restoring housing, refunding displaced patients, implementing financial transparency protocols, and investing in community-first policies. For the first time in years, the name Hawthorne Global was being associated with hope, not greed. There was still fallout to manage, investors to reassure, lawsuits to navigate, but we were moving forward. And people were watching in a good way this time. Later that week, I stood on the main floor of the children's hospital where Henry's name was engraved on a brass plaque above the entrance. Construction had already resumed. Nurses waved from the hallways. A child in a red beanie peeked around the corner, giggling as he spotted me and darted back. Life was returning. I reached out and touched the plaque gently. You were right, I whispered. It was never about profit. It was always about people. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, not just cleaning up someone else's mess, but building something that mattered. And this was only the beginning. The door to Henry's private study opened with a creak that seemed to echo through time. It hadn't been touched in over a year, sealed after his funeral, preserved like a shrine. The room smelled faintly of leather, cedarwood, and old memories. I stood just inside the threshold for a moment, letting the weight of it settle over me. This had been his space, his world. And yet, even in death, he had left me a key to it. The mahogany desk at the center of the room was pristine, its surface untouched, but for a single brass-handled safe embedded into its side. Graham had called the night before, telling me quietly, he left you something else. Something personal. You'll know it when you find it. I'd found the key in Henry's archived belongings, a tiny silver one wrapped in a note bearing my name. Use it when the noise dies down. Not before. Well, the noise was finally beginning to fade. The boardroom battles had quieted. The audits were underway. The restoration plans were in motion. And in the stillness of this room, I was ready. I knelt beside the desk and slid the key into the lock. It turned easily. The safe door opened with a soft pop of air and a familiar click. Inside was a single manila envelope and a property deed, thick with notary seals and handwritten annotations. My breath caught as I pulled them out. The letter came first. Elena, if you're reading this, it means you've done it. You've faced them. You've fought for what's right. And you've proven exactly what I always believed, that the strength in you is never conditional, never accidental. It was born of principle and grown through fire. There's one last thing I want you to have, not because it's valuable in the traditional sense, but because it's peaceful. A place where the noise won't reach you. A place where you can breathe. It was once meant for me to retire, but I never made it that far. Now, it's yours. Use it how you see fit. If that means building something new, do it. You have my blessing. Henry. Tears pricked my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Instead, I unfolded the deed. It was for a sprawling lakeside estate 2 hours north of the city, tucked into a quiet patch of pine forest I vaguely remembered Henry mentioning once. He had called it his escape hatch, a sanctuary. The next morning, I drove out alone, winding through sleepy towns and golden tree lines until I reached the wrought iron gates marked Hartley Point. The house was modest by Hartley standards, a craftsman-style lodge with wraparound porches, tall windows, and the glitter of a private lake just beyond the tree line. The moment I stepped onto the porch, I felt it. The quiet, the steadiness, the relief. I stood there for a long while, breathing in the scent of pine and lake air. And then, as the wind rustled the trees and the sun broke through the branches, the idea came to me, not just a sanctuary for myself, but something more. A refuge. A restoration of a different kind. Within a week, I filed the paperwork. The Hartley Wellness Center. The name felt right. A retreat for women in crisis, those navigating grief, betrayal, abuse, or burnout. A space for healing without judgment or bureaucracy. The estate had enough land to add cottages, therapy rooms, gardens, even a lakeside reflection path. And with the resources now available to me, nothing was out of reach. I assembled a team. Trauma counselors, financial advisors, social workers. We began developing programming, outreach, partnerships. The center would open within 6 months, free to those who needed it, funded entirely through a charitable trust created in Henry's name. A legacy not of scandal, but of sanctuary. Meanwhile, back in Monte Azure, we began repurposing the properties Victor had so smugly acquired under Margot's name. For luxury villas, all situated near the coast, with gated access and unnecessary opulence. We liquidated the most extravagant features, but kept the bones. The goal wasn't to erase the past, but to transform it. Each villa was remodeled into transitional housing for women fleeing domestic abuse, with private rooms, safety measures, and on-site legal support. One would be named Hope House. Another, New Light. It was poetic, in a way, turning the space they'd used to exclude and exploit into havens of inclusion and restoration. I visited the first completed shelter just before the official ribbon cutting. A young woman stood in the courtyard, holding the hand of a small child. She looked at the garden, then back at me, and said softly, "I didn't think anyone cared." I smiled, my throat tight. "We do now." Later that evening, I stood by the lake at Hartley Point, the sky painted in strokes of lavender and rose. The wind danced across the water. I thought of Henry, of everything he'd quietly handed me, not just control of a company, but the space to reshape its purpose. I wasn't just undoing the damage. I was building something enduring, something alive. 1 year later, I stood before a sea of faces in the newly renovated Hawthorne Global Atrium, the company's annual summit unfolding around me. A sleek black stage stretched across the room, lit softly by the cascading natural light of the glass dome above. The walls behind me bore our new mantra in elegant serif font, legacy through integrity. Power through purpose. A year ago, I was fighting to be heard. Now, I was the keynote speaker. The applause quieted as I stepped up to the podium, the mic catching only the slight breath I took to steady myself. But I didn't feel nervous. Not today. Today I felt grounded. Thank you, I began. Not just for being here, but for staying. For choosing to believe that rebuilding something broken isn't just possible, it's necessary. I paused to look out at the crowd, executives, team leaders, new recruits, long-standing staff. People who had survived the storm with me. Many of them had faced layoffs under Victor. Some had quietly suffered through Margot's manipulations. Others had simply lost faith. But they'd returned. Or stayed. And they were why the company hadn't just survived, it had transformed. It would have been easy to sweep things under the rug, I continued. To slap on a new coat of paint, rebrand, and carry on. But we didn't do that. We chose the hard path. We pulled the truth into the light. We apologized. We made amends. We listened. And we learned. The audience listened closely, many nodding. I let the silence speak for a moment before I stepped away from the podium. What you see today, the Hawthorne Global of now, is not just my work. It's ours. We reinstated our low-income housing initiatives. We refunded every family impacted by the rent hikes. We refunded the pediatric wing Henry Hartley began. And most importantly, we created internal systems to ensure no future leadership can ever operate in darkness again. I motioned to the side screen, where images cycled. Families returning to their homes, children in treatment rooms newly stocked with supplies, Marissa leading a workshop at the Hartley Integrity and Compliance Division. The room swelled with quiet pride. I once thought being cast aside meant defeat, I said, returning to the mic, that being excluded meant I didn't belong. But I learned something during all of this. You can be erased from someone's plan and still write your own story. You can be discarded and still build something extraordinary. The applause this time came with standing ovations. I smiled, humbled but strong. I had fought tooth and nail to get to this moment, and I knew better than to believe the journey was over. The thing about legacy was that it needed to be protected, not once, but every day. After the summit, I returned to my office, Henry's old space, though I'd made it my own. Warm woods replaced cold marble. Photographs of our restored housing, hospital visits, and the Hartley Wellness Center lined the shelves. I looked at one in particular. A group photo of the women at the lakeside retreat, their faces lit with laughter. That had been the hardest project. And the most rewarding. The Hartley Wellness Center had already supported over 300 women, providing everything from trauma therapy to job placement support. Some had returned to testify against abusers. Others had reunited with children. One had just started nursing school on a scholarship funded by the estate's charitable arm. The shelters in Monte Azure, too, had become sanctuaries. When I'd last visited, a young girl had asked if the ocean belonged to them now. I had knelt down, touched her hand, and said, "It always did." A soft knock broke my thoughts. Marissa entered, a folder in hand. "Press wants a final statement for the year-end report." I raised an eyebrow. "Do I sound presidential yet?" She smirked. "You sound like someone who did the impossible." I took the folder, flipped through it, and paused when I saw the last page, a handwritten note from an employee I'd never met. It read, "Thank you for not just fixing what was broken, but for reminding us that it never should have been broken in the first place. We believe again, because you did first." I blinked back the sudden burn in my eyes. After everything being sidelined, betrayed, underestimated, this was the reward. Not power for its own sake, but the restoration of purpose. Of people. Of belief. "I think we're ready," I said. Marissa nodded. "One last thing," she added, pulling a small box from her coat. "This was delivered from Graham Sterling. Said it belonged to Henry. He wanted you to have it, when the future stopped looking like a fight." I opened the box slowly. Inside was a simple gold compass, its edges worn with time. On the back, engraved in Henry's familiar hand, were the words, "True north is never where they say it is. Trust your own." I closed the box and held it for a moment. They had tried to erase me. But I'd found my direction and rebuilt the map. And the legacy? It wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. Ours. And it was just getting started.